Good evening. Picture this. It's the year 1274, and the most terrifying sound in the medieval world isn't the roar of a dragon or the wail of a banshee. It's the creaking of Mongol warships cutting through the storm-lashed waters of the Korea Strait, their hulls packed with 40,000 of the most ruthless warriors humanity has ever produced. These aren't just any warriors. These are the descendants of Genghis Khan's killing machine, the men who turned cities into ash and turned empires into footnotes, and they're heading straight for Japan. On the other side of those churning waters, on the beaches of Kyushu, samurai warriors kneel in the pre-dawn darkness, their hands steady on their katana hilts, despite the fact that their entire world is about to change forever. These men have spent their lives perfecting the art of single combat, of honor-bound duels where a warrior's name mattered more than his life. They have no idea that they're about to face an enemy that treats honor like a luxury they can't afford, an individual combat like a quaint custom from a simpler time. What's about to unfold is one of history's most savage culture clashes, a collision between two warrior philosophies so fundamentally different that it would be like watching a chess grandmaster try to survive a bar fight. The Mongols, who conquered more territory than any empire in human history, were about to discover that some islands refused to be conquered. The samurai, who had never faced an enemy quite like this, were about to learn that sometimes surviving is more important than dying beautifully. This is the story of the Mongol invasions of Japan, a tale of such blood-soaked chaos and supernatural intervention that it reads like the fever dream of a very disturbed historian. We'll explore how 40,000 Mongol warriors crossed the sea to introduce the samurai to the concept of total war, how Japanese defenders learned to adapt their code of honor to deal with enemies who had never read the rulebook, and how Mother Nature herself seemed to take sides in this apocalyptic showdown. We'll witness the first invasion of 1274, where traditional samurai warfare collided headfirst with Mongol tactics so brutal they made the samurai question everything they thought they knew about combat. We'll experience the second invasion of 1281, where Kublai Khan sent not 40,000 but 140,000 warriors to finish what his grandfather started, only to discover that sometimes the gods themselves pick sides in mortal conflicts. Tell me in the comments what corner of the world you're watching from, and whether your evening is as calm as a samurai meditation or as chaotic as a Mongol war council plotting world domination. And while you're at it, hit that subscribe button, because unlike the Mongol Empire, I promise not to show up at your borders demanding tribute. But before we dive into this blood-soaked historical nightmare, we need to understand what made these two warrior cultures so perfectly, terrifyingly incompatible. To understand the sheer horror that was about to descend upon Japan, you first need to grasp what the Mongols had already accomplished by 1274. This wasn't just another barbarian horde stumbling around the steppes looking for something to pillage. This was a military machine so efficient, so ruthlessly organized, that it had already devoured most of the known world and was getting bored with easy conquests. By the time Kublai Khan set his sights on Japan, the Mongol Empire stretched from Eastern Europe to the Pacific Ocean, covering roughly 16% of the entire planet's landmass. To put that in perspective, the Mongols controlled more territory than the Roman Empire at its peak, the British Empire at its height, and modern Russia combined. They had conquered China, obliterated the Islamic Golden Age, and made Europeans so terrified that they literally thought the Mongols were demons sent by God to punish them for their sins. The secret to Mongol success wasn't just their famous horseback, archery, or their superior mobility. It was their complete willingness to abandon any pretense of civilized warfare in favor of psychological terror so extreme it became a weapon of mass destruction. When Mongol armies approached a city, they would offer the defenders a simple choice: surrender immediately and become tax-paying vassals, or resist and watch every single person in your city die in the most creatively horrible ways the Mongol imagination could devise. This wasn't an empty threat. When Baghdad, the crown jewel of the Islamic world and one of the largest cities on earth, decided to resist Mongol conquest in 1258, the Mongols spent exactly 5 days turning it into a charnel house. They systematically murdered between 200,000 and 1 million people, destroyed libraries containing centuries of human knowledge, and left the city so thoroughly devastated that it didn't recover its pre-conquest population until the 20th century. The Tigris River reportedly ran black with ink from destroyed manuscripts and red with blood from slaughtered scholars. But the Mongols weren't just mindlessly brutal, they were strategically brutal, which somehow made it worse. They would deliberately leave a few survivors from each conquered city to spread tales of Mongol atrocities to neighboring settlements. These traumatized refugees became walking advertisements for Mongol terror, convincing entire regions to surrender without a fight, rather than risk sharing Baghdad's fate. The Mongol military system was built around speed, adaptability, and an almost supernatural ability to coordinate massive armies across vast distances without any form of electronic communication. Each Mongol warrior was expected to maintain multiple horses, allowing armies to travel up to 100 miles per day, while European knights were lucky to manage 25. They used a decimal organization system where armies were divided into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 warriors, with each level of command responsible for the actions of their subordinates on pain of death. Perhaps most terrifyingly, the Mongols were technological magpies, absorbing and improving upon every military innovation they encountered. When they conquered Chinese territories, they learned siege warfare and gunpowder weapons. When they fought Muslim armies, they adopted their engineering techniques. When they defeated European forces, they studied their armor and fortification methods. The Mongol army that would eventually sail for Japan wasn't just a nomadic horde. It was a multicultural military fusion powered by the accumulated military knowledge of 3 continents. Their archery skills bordered on the supernatural. Mongol warriors could accurately hit targets while riding at full gallop, a feat that required starting to train before they could properly walk. They used composite bows that could drive arrows through medieval armor at ranges that European crossbows couldn't match. A single Mongol warrior could carry up to 60 arrows into battle and empty his quiver in less than 3 minutes, all while maneuvering his horse with his knees. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Mongol warfare was their complete indifference to individual glory or heroic gestures. While European knights and Japanese samurai viewed combat as an opportunity to demonstrate personal valor, Mongols viewed it as a practical problem to be solved as efficiently as possible. If that meant using poison arrows, setting cities on fire, or pretending to retreat only to lead enemies into carefully prepared ambushes, so be it. Honor was a luxury that interfered with winning. By 1260, this terrifying war machine was under the control of Kublai Khan, Genghis Khan's grandson and perhaps the most ambitious ruler in human history. Kublai had already conquered the Song dynasty in southern China, making him the ruler of the world's most populous and technologically advanced civilization. He controlled the largest navy in the world, the most sophisticated siege weapons, and military engineers who could build bridges, catapults, and fortifications anywhere he needed them. But there was one problem with ruling most of the known world. Eventually, you run out of worlds to conquer. The Mongols had pushed as far west as they could, without starting a potentially disastrous war with European kingdoms that were finally getting organized enough to fight back effectively. They had conquered as much of the Islamic world as they could reach, without overextending their supply lines. Central Asia was already theirs, and northern China had been thoroughly mined. That left the islands. Japan, with its rumored wealth, its complete independence from Mongol authority, and its infuriating refusal to acknowledge Mongol supremacy, became an irresistible target. Here was a chance for Kublai Khan to demonstrate that even the seas themselves couldn't protect defiant kingdoms from Mongol wrath. The Japanese, blissfully isolated on their islands, had no idea what was coming. They had spent the last few centuries perfecting a form of warfare so ritualized, so bound by codes of honor and individual combat, that it was essentially the opposite of everything the Mongols represented. It was like preparing for a formal debate and instead finding yourself in a street fight with someone who brought while the Mongols were busy conquering half the world through practical brutality. The Japanese had spent centuries developing what might be the most psychologically complex warrior culture in human history. The samurai weren't just soldiers, they were living embodiments of a philosophical system so obsessed with honor, death, and aesthetic perfection that it would have given ancient Spartans pause. To understand just how unprepared the samurai were for what was coming, you need to grasp how completely their entire worldview was built around concepts that the Mongols would find completely incomprehensible. The samurai lived by a code called Bushido, the way of death, which taught that a warrior's ultimate purpose was to die beautifully in service to his lord, not to win battles, not to conquer territory, but to die in such a way that poets would write songs about it for centuries. This wasn't just philosophical posturing. Samurai genuinely believed that dying gloriously in combat was preferable to living with dishonor, a belief system that led to ritualized suicide becoming not just acceptable, but admirable. The practice of seppuku ritual disembowelment, performed to restore lost honor or avoid capture, was considered the height of warrior nobility. Imagine trying to explain this concept to a Mongol warrior, whose entire military philosophy was built around staying alive long enough to kill as many enemies as efficiently as possible. Japanese warfare in the late 13th century was essentially a series of elaborate, single combats between individual warriors, each trying to outdo the others in demonstrations of personal courage and martial skill. Before battles, samurai would ride out between the armies to announce their names, their lineage, their previous accomplishments, and their intentions, essentially providing their enemies with a detailed resume before trying to kill them. A typical samurai introduction would go something like this. I am Minamoto, descended from Emperor Seiwa, heir to lands granted by the shogun, trained in the way of the bow since childhood, victor in 17 single combats, and servant of the divine wind that protects our sacred islands. I seek an opponent worthy of my blade, that we might test our skills in honorable combat, and determine whose ancestors smile more brightly upon him. To a Mongol warrior, this would be like watching someone announce their home address, banking information, and daily schedule before asking to be murdered. The Mongol response would be to shoot the samurai full of arrows while he was still reciting his genealogy, then move on to killing his friends, burning his house, and enslaving his family. Honor was all well and good, but victory was better. The samurai fighting style was built around individual weapons mastery, particularly the katana, a sword so revered that it was considered to contain part of the warrior's soul. Samurai spent years learning not just how to use their swords effectively, but how to draw them with perfect form, how to clean them with religious precision, and how to die while holding them in exactly the right position. The katana wasn't just a weapon, it was a spiritual artifact, a piece of crafted steel that represented centuries of metallurgical perfection and philosophical contemplation. Japanese warfare tactics reflected this obsession with individual prowess. Battles were typically decided by a series of duels between champions, with armies watching respectfully while their best warriors proved their worth through single combat. The idea of surrounding an enemy, attacking from multiple directions simultaneously, or using ranged weapons to avoid close combat was considered cowardly and dishonorable. The samurai were magnificent archers, but they used their bows primarily for hunting and for demonstrating their skill in ritualized competitions. The idea of massing archers together to create overwhelming volleys of arrows was foreign to them. Each archer was expected to make individual shots that showcased his personal ability, not to contribute to a coordinated barrage designed to maximize casualties. Their armor, while beautiful and effective against traditional Japanese weapons, was designed for single combat between warriors using similar equipment. The distinctive plates and elegant curves of samurai armor were works of art that took months to create and were passed down through generations like family heirlooms. Each set was custom fitted to its owner and decorated with symbols representing his family, his achievements, and his spiritual beliefs. The samurai approach to siege warfare was equally ritualized. When attacking a fortified position, they would typically challenge the defenders to send out their champions for individual duels, with the results determining whether the siege would continue. The idea of using siege engines, undermining walls, or employing coordinated assault tactics was considered unnecessarily destructive and ungentlemanly. This might sound like a recipe for military disaster, and against the Mongols it absolutely was. But the samurai system had evolved to be perfectly suited for the type of warfare they had been fighting for centuries. Japan's mountainous terrain, decentralized political structure, and isolation from foreign military innovations had created an environment where individual, martial excellence was more important than tactical coordination. The samurai were superbly trained individual fighters, probably the most skilled one-on-one combatants in the world. Their physical conditioning, weapons training, and mental discipline were extraordinary. They could endure incredible hardships, fight with wounds that would incapacitate other warriors, and demonstrate levels of personal courage that bordered on the supernatural. But they were about to face an enemy that had spent 2 centuries perfecting the art of making individual courage irrelevant. The Mongols had learned that no matter how brave or skilled a single warrior might be, he was helpless against coordinated tactics, overwhelming numbers, and enemies who refused to play by the rules he understood. The psychological gap between these two warrior cultures was so vast that they might as well have been from different planets. The samurai fought to prove their worth to their ancestors, their lords, and their gods. The Mongols fought to win, and they had discovered that winning was usually easier if you abandoned most of the philosophical complications that other warriors insisted on dragging into combat. When news reached Japan that Mongol envoys were demanding submission, the samurai response was predictably honorable and spectacularly impracticable. Instead of immediately beginning preparations for total war against the most successful military machine in human history, they debated the proper way to respond to such unprecedented rudeness, consulted with priests about the spiritual implications of foreign invasion, and began composing poetry about their willingness to die defending their sacred homeland. The Mongols, meanwhile, were loading ships with siege engines, gunpowder weapons, and enough arrows to blot out the sun. The collision between these two worldviews was going to be spectacular, horrifying, and absolutely unforgettable. Before the Mongols decided to solve the Japan problem with overwhelming violence, they tried something that passed for diplomacy in the 13th century. This consisted mainly of sending increasingly threatening letters demanding submission, followed by even more threatening letters when the first ones didn't work, culminating in threats so creative and specific that they bordered on performance art. Kublai Khan's first diplomatic overture to Japan in 1268 was actually relatively polite by Mongol standards. The message, delivered by Korean intermediaries, because even the Mongols weren't crazy enough to personally deliver threatening ultimatums to samurai, was essentially a cosmic-level passive-aggressive note. It congratulated the Japanese on their beautiful islands, complimented their cultural achievements, and then casually mentioned that the Mongol Empire now controlled most of the civilized world, and it would be a shame if Japan had to be conquered violently when they could join willingly. The letter read, in part, from the Emperor of Great Mongolia to the King of Japan. Countries which are located far away from one another have different customs and languages. However, since the time of our ancestors, we have brought distant countries under our control through the use of armed force. We now rule territories so vast that the sun never sets on our empire. Japan is a small country, but its people are known for their courage and independence. We wish to establish friendly relations. It would be wise for you to send envoys to pay respects to our court. To modern readers, this might sound like a reasonable diplomatic opening. To the Japanese, it sounded like a cosmic insult wrapped in false courtesy. The letter addressed the Emperor of Japan as merely a king, referred to Japan as a small country, and heavily implied that resistance was futile. It was like receiving a dinner invitation that mentioned, in passing, that declining might result in your house being burned down. The Japanese response to this diplomatic overture was to ignore it completely, not reject it, not send a counter-proposal, not even acknowledge that they had received it. They simply pretended it had never happened, which, in Japanese diplomatic terms, was roughly equivalent to declaring war, while simultaneously questioning the legitimacy of the Mongol Empire's existence. Kublai Khan tried again in 1269, sending another letter that was slightly less polite and significantly more direct about the potential consequences of continued non-response. This second message abandoned the pretense of friendly cooperation and moved into the realm of detailed threat assessment. It pointed out that China and Korea had both submitted to Mongol rule and were prospering under Mongol protection, while countries that had resisted had experienced unfortunate urban renewal projects involving fire and death. The Japanese response to the second letter was identical to their response to the first. Absolutely nothing. The Mongol envoys waited on the Korean coast for months, apparently expecting Japanese representatives to eventually show up with tribute and apologies. Instead, they got the diplomatic equivalent of being left on read, which was somehow more insulting than an outright declaration of war would have been. By 1271, Kublai Khan's patience was wearing thin. The third letter dropped all pretense of diplomatic courtesy and moved into the realm of creative threat composition. It reminded the Japanese that the Mongol Empire had never failed to conquer a target, described in loving detail what had happened to the last few kingdoms that had ignored Mongol ultimatums, and suggested that Japan's isolation would make it particularly difficult for anyone to help. Then, when the consequences of their rudeness finally arrived, the Japanese response was to hold a series of high-level meetings to discuss the proper way to handle such an unprecedented breach of diplomatic etiquette. Various court officials suggested responding with their own letters, sending envoys to negotiate, or preparing military defenses. The final decision was to continue ignoring the Mongols while consulting with Shinto priests about whether the gods were displeased with foreign barbarians making demands of the emperor. From the Japanese perspective, their response made perfect sense. The emperor was a divine being, descended from the sun goddess Amaterasu, and Japan was a sacred land protected by the gods themselves. The idea that foreign barbarians could make demands of divinely appointed rulers was so fundamentally absurd that it didn't deserve acknowledgement. Responding to Mongol threats would be like dignifying the demands of particularly articulate bandits. From the Mongol perspective, the Japanese response was incomprehensibly arrogant. No one ignored the Great Khan. Kingdoms that tried usually discovered that ignoring Mongol ultimatums was an expensive mistake that could only be paid for with complete destruction. The Japanese were either the most confident people in the world or the most suicidal, and either way they were about to receive a comprehensive education in Mongol problem-solving techniques. The cultural misunderstanding was so complete that both sides were essentially having different conversations. The Mongols were conducting international relations according to a system where might made right and resistance was futile. The Japanese were operating under a worldview where divine protection made foreign conquest literally impossible, and responding to threats would legitimize the authority of the people making them. Making matters worse, the Japanese had no real understanding of what the Mongol Empire actually was or what it had accomplished. Living on isolated islands, they had limited information about the outside world and no direct experience with the kind of total war that the Mongols had perfected. To them, The Mongols were just another group of foreign barbarians making impossible demands, not representatives of a military machine that had conquered most of the known world. The Mongols, for their part, had no understanding of Japanese culture, religion, or political structure. They assumed that, like every other civilization they had encountered, Japan would eventually calculate the odds, realize that resistance was hopeless, and submit to Mongol authority in exchange for being allowed to keep existing. They had no concept of a culture that would choose destruction over submission as a matter of religious principle. By 1274, both sides had thoroughly convinced themselves that the other was completely unreasonable. Kublai Khan had decided that the Japanese were dangerously arrogant barbarians who needed to be taught a lesson in Mongol reality. The Japanese had decided that the Mongols were spiritually polluted invaders whose very presence was an insult to the gods. The stage was set for one of history's most spectacular cultural collisions. A meeting between two military philosophies so fundamentally incompatible that compromise was impossible and coexistence was unthinkable. The Mongols were about to discover that some islands really were protected by divine intervention. The Japanese were about to learn that sometimes the gods help those who help themselves, preferably with better military tactics. On November 5, 1274, the largest amphibious invasion force the world had ever seen appeared off the coast of Kyushu like something from a particularly violent fever dream. 40,000 Mongol, Korean, and Chinese warriors aboard 900 ships had crossed the treacherous waters of the Korea Strait, and they were absolutely furious about having spent the last week being violently seasick while contemplating the various ways they intended to express their displeasure with Japanese diplomacy. The sight that greeted Japanese coastal defenders was unlike anything in their historical experience. The Mongol fleet stretched across the horizon like a floating city, their ships connected by chains and ropes to create massive floating platforms for siege engines, cavalry horses, and enough weaponry to conquer a small continent. These weren't the elegant single-ship raids that occasionally troubled Japanese coastal communities. This was an invasion fleet designed to establish permanent Mongol authority over the sacred islands, and it looked exactly as terrifying as it was meant to. The first Japanese defenders to encounter Mongol forces were a group of samurai from the S-clan on Tsushima Island, a small piece of land that had the misfortune of being directly between Korea and Japan. These warriors had spent their lives preparing for honorable combat against fellow samurai, and they approached the Mongol landing with all the confidence of men who had never encountered an enemy that didn't share their commitment to ritualized warfare. The samurai's approach to dealing with the invasion was exactly what you would expect from warriors. Raised on a steady diet of honor codes and single combat, they rode out to meet the Mongols in small groups, announced their names and lineage, and challenged the invaders to face them in individual duels that would determine the fate of the island. It was like challenging a tornado to a chess match. The Mongol response was swift, practical, and absolutely horrifying. Instead of accepting the challenge to single combat, they surrounded the samurai with overwhelming numbers, showered them with arrows from multiple directions, and then finished off the survivors with coordinated cavalry charges. The entire engagement lasted less than an hour, and when it was over, Tsushima Island had been thoroughly conquered and most of its defenders were decorating the landscape. But the real horror wasn't just the efficiency of the Mongol conquest. It was the complete indifference to the rules of warfare that the Japanese considered sacred. Mongol warriors killed wounded enemies instead of allowing them to commit honorable suicide. They attacked from multiple directions simultaneously instead of engaging in fair single combat. They used smoke bombs, explosive devices, and coordinated archery volleys that made individual martial skill irrelevant. Most shocking of all, the Mongols treated samurai exactly like any other enemy soldiers. They didn't acknowledge the spiritual significance of samurai weapons, the importance of dying in the correct position, or the necessity of allowing defeated warriors to perform ritual suicide. To the Mongols, a dead enemy was a dead enemy, regardless of how poetically he had announced his intention to die. The survivors of Tsushima, who managed to escape to the mainland, brought tales of warfare so alien to Japanese experience that many refused to believe them. Stories of enemies who fought in coordinated formations, who used weapons that exploded in clouds of fire and smoke, who showed no respect for the sacred nature of individual combat, and who killed defeated warriors instead of allowing them to die with honor. The main Mongol landing at Hakata Bay was even more traumatic for Japanese defenders. Here, the cream of Kyushu samurai had gathered to repel the invasion, using traditional Japanese military doctrine, which involved challenging the enemy champions to decide the outcome through individual combat between the most skilled warriors on each side. The Mongols took one look at the Japanese formation, deployed their own forces in a coordinated battle line, and then demonstrated why individual heroism was no match for organized military science. They opened the engagement with a massive archery barrage that killed Japanese horses, wounded samurai before they could reach combat range, and created enough chaos to prevent any organized resistance. What followed was less a battle than a comprehensive demonstration of military evolution. The Mongol forces moved as a single, coordinated unit, with cavalry, infantry, and archers supporting each other in ways that the Japanese had never seen. When samurai charged forward to engage in single combat, they found themselves facing not individual opponents but entire formations designed to concentrate overwhelming force against isolated targets. The Mongols employed tactics that violated every rule of honorable warfare. They feigned retreats to draw samurai into ambushes, used explosive devices that killed horses and riders simultaneously, and concentrated their attacks on Japanese commanders to create leadership chaos. Most disturbing of all, they seemed completely uninterested in taking prisoners for ransom or allowing defeated enemies to surrender honorably. The Japanese defenders fought with incredible courage, but courage alone wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental tactical disadvantage they faced. Samurai who had trained their entire lives for single combat found themselves helpless against coordinated formations. Warriors who expected to face opponents wielding similar weapons discovered that Mongol composite bows could kill them before they could get close enough to use their katanas. The most psychologically devastating aspect of the invasion wasn't the military defeat, it was the complete collapse of the conceptual framework that Japanese warfare was built upon. The samurai code assumed that enemies would fight honorably, that individual skill mattered more than tactical coordination, and that death in battle was preferable to victory without honor. The Mongols demonstrated that all of these assumptions were not just wrong, but dangerously naive. Japanese warriors who survived encounters with Mongol forces reported feeling not just defeated, but spiritually violated. Their entire worldview had been built around the idea that martial excellence and moral purity were rewarded by the gods. The Mongol victory suggested either that the gods had abandoned Japan, or that foreign barbarians were somehow more favored than the descendants of the sun goddess. But just as it seemed that the Mongol conquest of Japan was inevitable, something extraordinary happened. On the evening of November 19th, 1274, a massive storm arose from nowhere and began systematically destroying the Mongol fleet. Ships that had survived the crossing from Korea were torn apart by winds and waves that seemed to appear specifically to punish the invaders. The storm was so sudden and so devastating that even the Mongols, who were used to dealing with unexpected setbacks, were caught completely off guard. Ships were driven onto rocks, scattered across the ocean, or simply vanished into the darkness. Thousands of warriors who had survived the landing and the subsequent battles drowned in the churning waters of Hakata Bay. Kublai Khan's first invasion of Japan ended not with glorious conquest, but with a humiliating retreat. As the surviving Mongol forces abandoned their beachheads and fled back across the Korea Strait, the Japanese, who had been preparing for total defeat, suddenly found themselves victorious through what appeared to be direct divine intervention. The psychological impact of this deliverance was enormous. The storm wasn't just a meteorological event, it was proof that Japan really was protected by the gods. The foreign invaders hadn't been defeated by superior Japanese military tactics. They had been punished by the divine wind itself. This conviction would shape Japanese military thinking for the next 7 years, with consequences that would prove both inspiring and catastrophic when the Mongols returned. The retreat of the Mongol fleet in 1274 created a psychological phenomenon that might be unique in military history. An entire nation convinced that it was literally impossible to defeat them because the gods themselves would intervene to prevent foreign conquest. This wasn't just religious confidence, it was metaphysical certainty backed by recent empirical evidence. After all, the Mongols had come with the largest invasion force in history, and the weather had destroyed them. What more proof of divine protection could anyone ask for? The Japanese interpretation of the 1274 invasion was that it had been a test of their spiritual worthiness, and they had passed with flying colors. The storm wasn't a random weather event, it was Kamikaze, the divine wind that the gods sent to protect the sacred islands from foreign pollution. The fact that this divine intervention had occurred just as the situation was becoming desperate proved that Japan was special, chosen, and absolutely unconquerable by foreign barbarians. This interpretation had some unfortunate side effects on Japanese military planning. Instead of analyzing what had gone wrong with their tactics and preparing for the inevitable return of the Mongols with better strategies, the Japanese spent most of the next 7 years building shrines to thank the gods for their protection and composing poetry about the spiritual significance of divine storms. The few Japanese military leaders who suggested that they might want to prepare for another invasion by improving their tactics, building better fortifications, or coordinating their defenses were generally considered to be demonstrating insufficient faith in divine protection. Why waste time on mundane military preparations when the gods had already proven their willingness to intervene directly? This isn't to say that the Japanese did nothing to prepare for the next invasion. They did make some improvements to their coastal defenses, including the construction of a stone wall along Hakata Bay that was designed to prevent future amphibious landings. But these preparations were undertaken more as demonstrations of their determination to defend the sacred islands than as practical military necessities. The construction of the Hakata Bay Wall was actually quite impressive from an engineering standpoint. The Japanese built a 20-kilometer stone barrier along the most likely invasion beaches, designed to force any future invaders to assault prepared positions rather than establishing beachheads on open sand. The wall was tall enough to provide cover for defenders and thick enough to withstand siege engines. But the wall also reflected some problematic assumptions about how the next invasion would unfold. It was designed to channel attackers into specific areas where they could be met by traditional Japanese military tactics, essentially forcing the Mongols to fight the kind of battle that the Japanese preferred. This was like building a chessboard and hoping that your opponents would be obligated to play chess, instead of setting the whole thing on fire. Meanwhile, Kublai Khan was experiencing the kind of rage that only comes from having a perfectly good military conquest interrupted by what appeared to be supernatural intervention. The great Khan was not accustomed to having his invasions thwarted by weather, and he took the failure of the first invasion as a personal insult from the universe itself. Kublai's analysis of the 1274 failure was typically Mongol in its practical focus. The storm had been an unfortunate coincidence, not divine intervention. The invasion had failed because the fleet had been too small, the logistics had been inadequate, and the timing had been wrong. These were all problems that could be solved with better planning, more resources, and overwhelming force. The Khan spent the next 7 years preparing for a second invasion that would make the first. One looked like a small-scale reconnaissance mission. If 40,000 warriors had been insufficient, then he would send 140,000. If 900 ships had been vulnerable to storms, Then he would build a fleet so large that no weather system could destroy all of it. If Japanese resistance had been stronger than expected, then he would bring siege engines, gunpowder, weapons, and military engineers capable of reducing Japanese fortifications to rubble. The Mongol preparations for the second invasion were a masterpiece of logistical planning and resource allocation. Kublai Khan effectively stripped the resources of his entire empire to build an invasion fleet that would be absolutely, unquestionably irresistible. He conscripted shipbuilders from across China and Korea, commandeered every available vessel, and began the largest military construction project in human history. The second invasion fleet would consist of two separate armadas, one launching from Korea and another from southern China, converging on Japan simultaneously to prevent the Japanese from concentrating their defenses. The combined force would include not just warriors, but also the craftsmen, administrators, and colonists necessary to establish permanent Mongol rule over the conquered islands. But the most significant change in Mongol strategy was their decision to treat the invasion of Japan as a war of extermination rather than conquest. Kublai Khan had concluded that the Japanese were inherently rebellious and would never make reliable vassals. Therefore, the second invasion would focus not just on defeating Japanese military forces, but on systematically destroying Japanese culture, religion, and political structure. This decision represented a fundamental shift in Mongol policy. Usually, the Mongols preferred to leave conquered populations intact as taxpayers and laborers. The Japanese had managed to annoy them so thoroughly that they were willing to abandon this practical approach in favor of what amounted to cultural genocide. While the Mongols were planning total war, the Japanese were experiencing a golden age of religious confidence and cultural production. The victory of 1274 had convinced them that they were living in a divinely favored nation, and this conviction inspired an explosion of artistic and literary creativity focused on themes of spiritual purity and sacred protection. Japanese poets composed elaborate verses celebrating the Kamikaze and the spiritual strength that had made divine intervention possible. Priests developed new rituals designed to ensure continued divine protection. Artists created paintings and sculptures depicting the storm as a manifestation of the gods' favor toward Japan. This cultural confidence was genuinely beautiful, but it was also tactically disastrous. The Japanese had essentially convinced themselves that conventional military preparation was unnecessary because supernatural forces would intervene to protect them. It was like deciding that you don't need to lock your doors because you have guardian angels. The few Japanese military leaders who recognized the danger tried to warn their colleagues that divine protection might be most effective when combined with practical military preparation. They pointed out that the gods often helped those who helped themselves, and that assuming supernatural intervention was guaranteed might be presumptuous. These warnings were largely ignored. The Japanese had seen proof of divine protection with their own eyes, and they were confident that the gods would not abandon their chosen people when faced with a second foreign invasion. After all, Japan was the land of the rising sun, protected by the goddess Amaterasu herself. What could foreign barbarians possibly do against such divine favor? The stage was set for one of the most catastrophic cultural collisions in human history. A nation convinced of its divine invincibility facing an enemy determined to prove that gods could be defeated by sufficient application of violence. By the summer of 1281, Kublai Khan had assembled what was unquestionably the largest invasion force in human history prior to the 20th century. The numbers alone were staggering enough to give anyone pause. 140,000 warriors, 4,400 ships, and enough military equipment to conquer half of Europe. But the truly terrifying aspect wasn't the size of the invasion force. It was the methodical precision with which it had been organized to overcome every possible form of Japanese resistance. The Mongol fleet that appeared off the coast of Japan in June 1281 wasn't just large. It was a floating military-industrial complex designed to establish permanent Mongol dominion over the Japanese islands. Unlike the first invasion, which had been essentially a large-scale raid. The second invasion brought everything necessary to completely restructure Japanese society according to Mongol specifications. The invasion force included not just warriors, but also administrators trained in Mongol governmental systems, craftsmen equipped to build Mongol-style cities, farmers prepared to establish Mongol agricultural techniques, and priests ready to replace Japanese religious practices with Mongol spiritual customs. Kublai Khan wasn't planning to merely conquer Japan. He was planning to turn it into a Mongol province so thoroughly integrated into his empire that future rebellion would be literally inconceivable. The military component of the invasion force represented everything the Mongols had learned about siege warfare, naval combat, and the conquest of island territories. They brought trebuchets capable of hurling 300-pound stones over Japanese fortifications, primitive cannons loaded with explosive shells, and enough arrows to maintain continuous barrage fire for weeks. Most ominously, they brought detailed maps of Japanese coastlines, intelligence reports on Japanese military capabilities, and battle plans specifically designed to counter every defensive strategy the Japanese had employed in 1274. The Japanese response to the appearance of this enormous invasion force was exactly what you would expect from a people who had spent 7 years convincing themselves that divine protection made conventional military defeat impossible. Instead of panic, they experienced a kind of spiritual excitement, as if they were about to witness another demonstration of godly favor toward the chosen islands. The improved fortifications at Hakata Bay were ready for the invasion, and Japanese defenders had positioned themselves behind the stone wall with all the confidence of men who believed they were fighting on the same side as the universe itself. They had spent the intervening years not just building walls, but also perfecting their military techniques, and they were eager to show the returning barbarians how much Japanese martial arts had improved since the last encounter. But the Mongols had also spent 7 years perfecting their techniques, and their improvements were considerably more practical than the Japanese ones. Instead of attempting another direct assault on Hakata Bay, they implemented a multi-pronged invasion strategy that demonstrated just how thoroughly they had analyzed the failures of 1274. The Korean fleet, consisting of about 900 ships and 40,000 warriors, approached Kyushu as expected and began probing attacks against Japanese coastal defenses. But, instead of committing to a major assault, they limited themselves to diversionary raids designed to draw Japanese attention and military resources to the obvious landing sites. Meanwhile, the much larger Chinese fleet, carrying 100,000 warriors and the bulk of the invasion's siege equipment, sailed past Kyushu entirely and headed for the less defended islands of Hirado and Takashima. This southern force included the engineering specialists, the heavy artillery, and the administrative personnel necessary to establish permanent Mongol control over Japanese territory. The Japanese defenders suddenly found themselves facing exactly the kind of coordinated, multi-directional assault that their military doctrine was least equipped to handle. Their entire defensive strategy had been based on the assumption that the Mongols would obligingly attack their strongest fortifications head-on, allowing the Japanese to meet them with traditional tactics behind prepared positions. Instead, the Mongols were demonstrating the same tactical flexibility that had made them masters of 3 continents. They avoided Japanese strengths, exploited Japanese weaknesses, and forced the defenders to fight the kind of campaign that favored Mongol organizational advantages over Japanese individual martial excellence. The initial Japanese response was to divide their forces to meet both invasion threats simultaneously, which was exactly what the Mongols had hoped they would do. Japanese military commanders, trained to think in terms of honorable single combat between champions, struggled to coordinate defensive operations across multiple islands against enemies who refused to concentrate their attacks in predictable locations. The fighting that erupted across southern Japan in the summer of 1281 was unlike anything the world had seen before. The Mongols brought military technologies that were literally centuries ahead of anything the Japanese possessed, including early firearms, sophisticated siege engines, and coordination techniques that allowed massive armies to operate as single unified forces. The Japanese defenders found themselves facing not just superior numbers, but also superior tactics, superior equipment, and enemies who had spent decades perfecting the art of conquering people who thought they were unconquerable. Mongol arrows were more accurate, Mongol armor was more effective, and Mongol military formations were designed to make individual heroism irrelevant. Most demoralizing of all, the Mongols seemed completely immune to the spiritual weapons that the Japanese had been counting on. Buddhist prayers didn't make Mongol arrows miss their targets. Shinto rituals didn't cause Mongol siege engines to malfunction. The divine protection that had been so evident in 1274 seemed to have taken a vacation just when it was needed most. For 7 weeks, the outcome of the invasion hung in the balance. The Mongols established secure beachheads, captured Japanese fortifications, and began the systematic conquest of southern Japan. Japanese resistance was fierce, but increasingly hopeless, as traditional samurai tactics proved inadequate against coordinated Mongol military science. Japanese defenders fought with incredible courage, but courage wasn't enough to overcome the fundamental military disadvantages they faced. Samurai who charged Mongol positions were cut down by crossbow bolts before they could reach melee range. Japanese fortifications were reduced to rubble by siege engines that could operate beyond the range of Japanese weapons. Individual acts of heroism, no matter how spectacular, were rendered meaningless by Mongol tactical coordination. By early August, it appeared that Kublai Khan's second invasion would succeed where the first had failed. The Mongol forces had established control over significant portions of southern Japan, captured several important fortifications, and were preparing for the final assault on the main Japanese defensive positions. Japanese morale was beginning to crack under the sustained pressure of facing an enemy that seemed invulnerable to both physical and spiritual weapons. Some samurai began to question whether the divine protection they had relied upon had been withdrawn due to some collective spiritual failure. Others wondered whether the Mongols possessed supernatural powers of their own that made them immune to Japanese spiritual advantages. But the gods, it turned out, were just taking their time. On August 15th and 16th, 1281, exactly 7 years after the divine wind had saved Japan from the first invasion, another typhoon arose from the Pacific and began systematically destroying the Mongol fleet. This second kamikaze was even more devastating than the first. The storms lasted for 2 days and 2 nights, with winds so powerful that they lifted ships out of the water and hurled them onto the shore like toys. The Mongol fleet, for all its size and sophisticated construction, was no match for typhoon-force winds and 30-foot waves. When the storms finally subsided, the largest invasion force in history had been reduced to scattered wreckage and bodies washing ashore on Japanese beaches. Of the 140,000 warriors who had sailed from China and Korea, only a fraction survived to make the journey home. The rest had learned that while the Mongol Empire might be invincible on land, the gods of Japan controlled the seas around the sacred islands. The psychological impact of this second divine intervention was even more profound than the first. Japan hadn't just been saved from conquest, it had been saved from conquest by what was unquestionably the most powerful military force in the world. If the gods could defeat Kublai Khan's armada, then Japan was truly unconquerable by any earthly power. The destruction of the second Mongol invasion fleet created psychological consequences that would echo through Japanese culture for the next 7 centuries. For the Japanese, the Kamikaze of 1281 wasn't just military deliverance, it was cosmic validation of their special relationship with the divine. They had been tested twice by the greatest military power on earth, and twice the gods had intervened directly to preserve Japan's independence. This conviction of divine protection became one of the foundational myths of Japanese culture. shaping everything from military doctrine to religious practices to national identity. The Kamikaze wasn't just a historical event. It was proof that Japan was literally the chosen land of the gods, destined to remain pure and unconquered for all eternity. The immediate aftermath of the second invasion's failure was a period of almost manic religious celebration. Temples across Japan held special ceremonies to thank the gods for their protection. New shrines were built specifically to honor the Kamikaze. Priests developed elaborate rituals designed to ensure continued divine favor. The entire country seemed to be in the grip of a spiritual high that bordered on the pathological. Japanese art and literature from this period is saturated with themes of divine protection and sacred invincibility. Poets composed epic cycles celebrating the Kamikaze as the ultimate demonstration of Japan's spiritual superiority. Artists created paintings depicting the typhoons as manifestations of the gods themselves, with divine figures riding the winds to destroy the foreign invaders. But perhaps the most significant psychological consequence was the development of what historians now recognize as the first version of Japanese exceptionalism, the belief that Japan was fundamentally different from and superior to all other nations because of its special divine protection. This wasn't just nationalism, it was metaphysical supremacism backed by empirical evidence. The Japanese conviction that their islands were divinely protected would influence their military thinking for centuries. Why develop innovative tactics when the gods would intervene to defeat any enemy? Why study foreign military techniques when divine protection made such knowledge unnecessary? Why worry about the changing nature of warfare when spiritual purity guaranteed victory? These attitudes would prove both inspiring and catastrophic in Japan's future military encounters. The same divine confidence that had helped them survive the Mongol invasions would eventually contribute to military disasters in the 19th and 20th centuries, when Japanese leaders assumed that spiritual superiority could overcome material disadvantages. For the Mongols, the failure of the second invasion was a psychological catastrophe of equally profound dimensions. This was the military machine that had conquered China, destroyed the Islamic Golden Age, and terrorized Europe. They had never failed to conquer a target when they committed their full resources to the task. The destruction of their invasion fleet by weather seemed to violate the fundamental laws of military reality. Kublai Khan's response to the disaster was characteristic. Mongol pragmatism mixed with what might have been the first case of clinical depression in recorded Mongol history. He immediately began planning a third invasion, because admitting that Japan was unconquerable would have undermined the entire ideological foundation of the Mongol Empire. But his heart wasn't in it, and the third invasion never materialized. The failure of the Japanese invasions marked the beginning of the end of Mongol expansion. An empire that had defined itself through constant conquest suddenly found itself facing enemies it couldn't defeat and territories it couldn't reach. The psychological impact of being thwarted by weather was devastating to Mongol morale and imperial confidence. More practically, the invasions had been enormously expensive in terms of both resources and manpower. The Mongol Empire had invested the equivalent of several years of imperial revenue in building invasion fleets that had been destroyed by storms. The human cost was equally staggering, with tens of thousands of Mongol, Chinese, and Korean warriors lost to typhoons rather than enemy action. The failure also demonstrated the limits of Mongol military adaptability. They had proven that they could learn to fight in deserts, mountains, forests, and plains. They had mastered siege warfare, naval combat, and coordinated operations across vast distances. But they couldn't control the weather, and in the case of Japan, weather was apparently the decisive factor in determining military outcomes. From a broader historical perspective, the Mongol invasions of Japan represented one of the last great cultural collisions of the medieval world. Two completely different approaches to warfare, honor, and the nature of divine intervention had met in combat. and the results had been both spectacular and decisive. The samurai had learned that individual martial excellence, while admirable, was insufficient against coordinated military science. They had been forced to adapt their tactics, improve their fortifications, and develop new approaches to large-scale warfare. But they had also been validated in their belief that Japan was under special divine protection. The Mongols had learned that even the most sophisticated military machine could be defeated by forces beyond human control. They had discovered the limits of their own power and the boundaries of their imperial expansion. But they had also demonstrated that traditional warrior cultures, no matter how courageous, were helpless against modern military techniques. The invasions established patterns of Japanese military thinking that would persist for centuries. The conviction that spiritual purity and divine protection were more important than tactical innovation would influence Japanese military doctrine through the Meiji Restoration and into World War II. The Kamikaze of 1274 and 1281 became the template for understanding how Japan could defeat superior enemies through divine intervention and spiritual dedication. But the invasions also established Japan's reputation as a uniquely difficult target for foreign conquest. The combination of geographic isolation, fierce indigenous resistance, and apparently supernatural weather patterns made Japan seem unconquerable to potential invaders. This reputation would persist until the 19th century, when advances in naval technology finally made Japanese isolation vulnerable to foreign pressure. The psychological legacy of the Mongol invasions is visible in Japanese culture to this day. The kamikaze became one of the defining myths of Japanese identity, proof that the gods themselves favored Japan over its enemies. The memory of successful resistance to foreign invasion became a source of national pride and cultural confidence that would shape Japanese responses to foreign pressure for centuries. To truly understand the horrifying nature of the Mongol samurai conflicts, you need to grasp the vast technological and tactical gap between the two military systems. This wasn't just a clash between different fighting styles. It was a collision between different centuries of military evolution, as if medieval knights had been forced to fight a modern army using weapons and tactics they had never encountered. The Mongol military arsenal of 1274 and 1281 represented the accumulated military knowledge of 3 continents and 2 centuries of constant warfare. They brought weapons that the Japanese had never seen, tactics that Japanese military doctrine couldn't counter, and technologies that seemed almost supernatural to defenders who were still fighting with equipment that their grandfathers would have recognized. The Mongol composite bow was perhaps the most terrifying individual weapon on the battlefield. These weren't the simple longbows that European armies used, but sophisticated pieces of military engineering made from laminated wood, horn, and sinew that could drive arrows through armor at ranges that Japanese archers couldn't match. A skilled Mongol archer could accurately hit targets at 350 meters, nearly twice the effective range of Japanese bows, and could maintain a rate of fire that would empty a 60-arrow quiver in less than 5 minutes. But the individual superiority of Mongol archery was less important than the way they used it tactically. Instead of the Japanese approach of individual archers demonstrating personal skill through precise shots at specific targets, the Mongols employed massed archery formations designed to create killing zones where individual armor and skill became irrelevant. Thousands of arrows fired simultaneously could blanket an entire area, making it impossible for charging cavalry or infantry to reach Mongol positions. The psychological impact of facing a Mongol arrow storm was devastating to samurai, who had been trained to expect single combat with individual opponents. Instead of facing warriors who would challenge them to honorable duels, Japanese defenders found themselves under continuous bombardment from enemies who remained safely beyond the range of retaliation. It was like trying to fight an opponent who refused to get close enough to be hit back. The Mongols also brought siege weapons that were completely unknown in Japan. The trebuchet, a massive stone-throwing engine that could hurl 300-pound projectiles over castle walls, was beyond anything Japanese military engineers had ever conceived. These machines could reduce Japanese fortifications to rubble from distances that made counterattack impossible, turning sieges from contests of endurance into exercises in systematic destruction. Even more unsettling were the early firearms that the Mongols employed. These primitive cannons and fire lancers weren't particularly accurate or reliable, but they produced explosions, smoke clouds, and psychological effects that Japanese defenders had no framework for understanding. The noise alone was unlike anything in Japanese military experience, and the sight of weapons that seemed to harness the power of lightning was profoundly disturbing. Two warriors raised on traditional concepts of combat. The Mongols brought coordinated cavalry formations that moved like single organisms across the battlefield. These weren't individual mounted warriors seeking personal glory, but integrated military units where each rider was part of a larger tactical system. Mongol cavalry could execute complex maneuvers while maintaining formation integrity, appearing suddenly at weak points in enemy lines, delivering devastating attacks, and then withdrawing before effective counterattacks could be organized. Perhaps most horrifying of all were the Mongol naval innovations. The invasion fleets of 1274 and 1281 included ships, connected by chains and ropes to create floating platforms for siege engines and cavalry operations. This allowed the Mongols to bring their land-based tactical advantages to naval warfare, essentially creating mobile fortresses that could deliver overwhelming firepower against coastal defenses. The Japanese military equipment, while beautifully crafted and perfectly suited for traditional Japanese warfare, was simply inadequate for dealing with Mongol innovations. The katana, for all its legendary quality and spiritual significance, was primarily a close combat weapon designed for dueling with similarly armed opponents. Against Mongol composite armor and coordinated formations, the katana's advantages in individual combat became irrelevant. Japanese armor, with its distinctive plates and elegant design, was effective protection against traditional Japanese weapons, but vulnerable to Mongol arrows fired from close range. The spiritual and aesthetic elements of samurai equipment, while psychologically important to the warriors who wore them, provided no practical advantages against enemies who were indifferent to their symbolic significance. The Japanese approach to fortification was similarly mismatched to Mongol capabilities. Japanese castles were designed to withstand siege by armies using traditional Japanese military techniques, essentially turning sieges into extended series of individual combats between champions. Against Mongol trebuchets and coordinated assault tactics, these fortifications were dangerously vulnerable. But the most significant difference wasn't in individual weapons or specific technologies. It was in the overall approach to warfare itself. The Mongols treated combat as a practical problem to be solved as efficiently as possible, using whatever combination of tactics, weapons, and strategies would produce victory with minimum cost. The Japanese treated combat as a spiritual and aesthetic activity, where the manner of fighting was as important as the outcome. This philosophical gap extended to every aspect of military operations. Mongol armies moved as coordinated units where individual warriors were expected to subordinate their personal glory to overall tactical objectives. Japanese armies were essentially collections of individual warriors, each seeking to demonstrate personal valor through spectacular individual achievements. The Mongol command structure was designed to coordinate the activities of tens of thousands of warriors across vast battlefields, using signal systems, predetermined plans, and standardized tactical procedures. Japanese military leadership was based on personal relationships between individual warriors and their lords, with coordination happening through personal communication between known individuals. When these two military systems collided, the results were predictably one. Japanese individual martial excellence was neutralized by Mongol tactical coordination, Japanese spiritual motivation was overcome by Mongol practical efficiency. Japanese honor-bound combat was defeated by Mongol willingness to use whatever methods would produce victory. The only equalizer in these otherwise hopelessly uneven contests was the weather. The typhoons that destroyed both Mongol invasion fleets were more effective than any Japanese weapon, more devastating than any samurai tactic, and more decisive than any strategic innovation. The Kamikaze succeeded where Japanese military science had failed, proving that sometimes the gods really do intervene in human affairs. The irony is that the divine wind that saved Japan was probably more destructive to the Mongol forces than the Japanese defenders ever could have been using conventional military means. The storms of 1274 and 1281 killed more Mongol warriors than died in all the land battles combined, and destroyed military equipment that represented decades of imperial resource allocation. From the Japanese perspective, this supernatural intervention validated their entire approach to warfare. They had been outfought, but not conquered, defeated in battle, but victorious in war, because their spiritual purity had earned them divine protection. The Kamikaze proved that honor, courage, and faith were more important than tactical innovation or technological superiority. From the Mongol perspective, the typhoons represented the ultimate military frustration, defeat by an enemy they couldn't fight, couldn't predict, and couldn't counter. All their tactical superiority, technological advantages, and strategic planning had been rendered irrelevant by weather patterns that were completely beyond human control. The true horror of the Mongol invasions of Japan wasn't just the clash of military technologies or the collision of warrior philosophies. It was the human cost. The tens of thousands of individual lives destroyed in the pursuit of imperial expansion and divine validation. Behind every tactical innovation and strategic maneuver were real people experiencing real terror, real pain, and real death in ways that their cultures had never prepared them for. The Japanese casualties from both invasions were never accurately recorded, partly because accurate record-keeping during active combat was impossible, and partly because Japanese military culture was more concerned with honoring the dead than counting them. But the psychological impact on Japanese society was profound and lasting. Entire families of samurai were wiped out during the fighting, taking with them centuries of accumulated military tradition and cultural knowledge. The survivors of encounters with Mongol forces often returned home as fundamentally changed men, carrying psychological wounds that Japanese society had no framework for understanding. These warriors had seen their entire worldview collapse under the impact of enemy tactics that made traditional concepts of honor and individual combat seem not just inadequate but actively dangerous. Japanese accounts from the period describe samurai who had survived battles with Mongol forces but could never again function as traditional warriors. They had seen too much of what coordinated military science could do to individual heroism, and they could no longer maintain the psychological certainty that traditional Japanese warfare required. Some became priests, seeking spiritual healing for traumas that their culture couldn't explain. Others became hermits, unable to reintegrate into a society that still believed in concepts they had seen proven false. The families of Japanese warriors killed in the invasions faced a particular kind of grief. Traditional Japanese military culture provided elaborate frameworks for honoring warriors who died in single combat, complete with rituals, ceremonies, and social recognition for families who had lost members in honorable warfare. But the men who died fighting the Mongols often died in ways that didn't fit traditional categories of honorable death. Japanese warriors killed by Mongol arrow storms never had a chance to demonstrate individual prowess. Men crushed by trebuchet stones died without ever seeing their killers. Samurai who drowned when their ships were sunk by enemy naval tactics died in ways that traditional Japanese military culture considered undignified and spiritually problematic. The Mongol casualties were even more staggering in absolute numbers. though perhaps less psychologically devastating to their home cultures. The Mongol Empire was accustomed to absorbing large military losses in pursuit of strategic objectives, and their cultural systems were designed to honor collective achievements rather than individual fates. The first invasion of 1274 probably killed around 13,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean warriors. Most of them drowned when the typhoon destroyed their fleet, rather than killed in combat with Japanese defenders. The survivors who made it back to the mainland brought tales of an enemy protected by supernatural forces, stories that would influence Mongol planning for the second invasion. The second invasion of 1281 was a human catastrophe on a scale that defied contemporary understanding. Of the 140,000 warriors who sailed with the invasion fleet, probably fewer than 20,000 survived to return home. The rest died in ways that their military training had never prepared them for, not in glorious battle against worthy opponents, but as helpless victims of weather patterns that turned the sea itself into an enemy. The psychological impact on Mongol survivors was profound. These were warriors from a culture that defined itself through military success and the conquest of impossible objectives. They had been part of the largest invasion force in human history, equipped with the most advanced military technology available, supported by the resources of the most powerful empire on earth, and they had been defeated by storms. Many Mongol survivors of the Japanese invasions never fully recovered from the experience of being rendered completely helpless by forces beyond human control. Mongol military culture was built around the idea that superior tactics, better equipment, and more disciplined troops could overcome any enemy. The Kamikaze suggested that sometimes victory was impossible regardless of human military excellence. The Korean and Chinese conscripts, who formed the majority of the invasion forces, faced additional psychological burdens. They had been forced to participate in wars that weren't their own, to fight enemies who had never threatened their homelands, in pursuit of imperial objectives that provided them no personal benefits. When the invasions failed, they faced not just physical survival, but also the knowledge that their sacrifices had been meaningless. The logistics of dealing with so many casualties created additional horrors. The beaches of southern Japan were littered with thousands of bodies from the destroyed invasion fleets, creating public health crises that Japanese communities had no experience managing. Traditional Japanese burial customs were completely inadequate for dealing with mass casualties, especially foreign casualties whose religious and cultural needs were unknown. The Japanese response to this unprecedented problem revealed both the nobility and the limitations of their cultural systems. Many Japanese communities organized elaborate funeral ceremonies for Mongol dead, treating enemy casualties with the same respect they would have shown their own fallen warriors. This was consistent with Buddhist teachings about the universal nature of suffering, but it also created logistical problems that strained local resources. The environmental impact of the invasions was equally severe. The wreckage of thousands of ships polluted Japanese coastal waters for years after the invasions ended. The bodies of dead horses, warriors, and sailors created contamination problems that affected fishing communities and coastal agriculture. The physical scars of the invasions remained visible on the Japanese landscape for decades. But perhaps the most profound human cost was the way the invasions changed the fundamental nature of Japanese society. The pre-invasion world of ritualized combat between individual warriors was gone forever, replaced by a military culture that had learned the necessity of coordinated defense against foreign enemies who didn't share Japanese values or respect Japanese traditions. The Japanese who survived the invasions lived in a world where foreign conquest was a real possibility, where traditional military virtues might be insufficient for national survival, and where even divine protection might require human cooperation to be effective. This knowledge fundamentally altered Japanese culture, making it simultaneously more confident in its spiritual superiority and more aware of its military vulnerabilities. The Mongol Empire never fully recovered from the human and material losses of the failed Japanese invasions. The deaths of so many experienced warriors, the destruction of so much naval equipment, and the psychological impact of being defeated by weather severely weakened Mongol military capabilities, just as they were facing increasing resistance in other parts of their empire. The invasions also demonstrated the limits of Mongol adaptability. They had learned to fight effectively in every type of terrain and climate they had encountered, but they couldn't learn to control typhoons. The realization that some enemies were literally beyond their reach marked the beginning of the end of Mongol expansion and the start of their transition from a conquering empire to a defensive one. The ultimate human cost of the Mongol invasions of Japan wasn't just the tens of thousands who died in the fighting and the storms. It was the fundamental transformation of two entire cultures, each forced to confront the limitations of their own worldviews and adapt to a world where their traditional assumptions about warfare, honor, and divine intervention had been tested to the breaking point. The Japanese learned that spiritual purity and individual courage, while admirable and ultimately victorious, might not always be sufficient without practical military preparation and tactical coordination. The Mongols learned that even the most sophisticated military machine could be defeated by forces beyond human control, and that some objectives might be literally impossible regardless of the resources committed to achieving them. In the aftermath of the failed Mongol invasions, something extraordinary happened to the historical narrative of these events. What had been a series of military campaigns, political decisions, and meteorological coincidences transformed into something approaching religious mythology. The Kamikaze stopped being weather and became proof of divine intervention. The samurai defenders stopped being human warriors and became legendary figures capable of supernatural feats. The invasions themselves stopped being historical events and became foundational myths that would shape Japanese culture for centuries. This mythologization process began almost immediately after the second invasion's failure in 1281. Japanese poets, priests, and chroniclers couldn't resist the temptation to transform what had been a terrifying brush with conquest into a triumphant demonstration of Japanese spiritual superiority. Every aspect of the invasions was reinterpreted through the lens of divine providence and heroic resistance. The kamikaze itself became the central element of a new Japanese creation myth. The typhoons weren't random weather events that had coincidentally occurred during Mongol invasions. They were manifestations of divine will specifically deployed to protect the sacred islands from foreign pollution. The gods hadn't just helped Japan, they had actively intervened in human affairs to preserve Japanese purity. This interpretation had profound implications for Japanese self-perception. If the gods themselves had taken sides in the conflict, then Japan wasn't just another nation among many. It was the chosen land of divine beings who would protect it from any foreign threat. This conviction of special divine favor would influence Japanese foreign policy, military doctrine, and cultural identity for the next 6 centuries. The samurai who had fought in the invasions underwent their own mythological transformation. Historical accounts of their actual performance, which had been mixed at best against Mongol tactical superiority, were gradually replaced by tales of supernatural heroism and impossible martial feats. Individual samurai were credited with single-handedly defeating hundreds of enemies, surviving wounds that should have been fatal, and demonstrating spiritual powers that transcended normal human limitations. The creation of these heroic legends served important psychological functions for Japanese society. The real story of the invasions, which involved Japanese forces being systematically outfought by superior Mongol military science until weather intervened to save them, was psychologically unsatisfying and potentially damaging to Japanese military confidence. The mythologized version, in which Japanese spiritual superiority and individual heroism had been validated by divine intervention, was much more conducive to cultural self-respect and future military morale. One of the most famous legendary figures to emerge from this mythologization process was Takazaki Suinaga, a minor samurai whose actual role in the invasions had been relatively insignificant, but who became the subject of elaborate pictorial scrolls depicting him as a warrior of supernatural courage and skill. These scrolls, known as the Miko Shrai Ikutoba, transformed Suinaga from a footnote in the historical record into a legendary hero whose exploits became models for future samurai behavior. The scrolls depicted scenes that were physically impossible but psychologically satisfying. Individual samurai charging through clouds of Mongol arrows without being touched. Japanese warriors cutting down dozens of enemies in single combat, and divine beings appearing on the battlefield to aid Japanese defenders. These images became more influential than actual historical records in shaping popular understanding of what had happened during the invasions. The Mongols themselves underwent a curious transformation in Japanese popular memory. The terrifyingly efficient military machine that had nearly conquered Japan was gradually reimagined as a horde of demonic barbarians whose defeat proved the spiritual superiority of Japanese civilization. The Mongol military innovations that had given Japanese defenders such trouble were reinterpreted as evidence of Mongol spiritual corruption and reliance on unnatural methods. This demonization of the Mongols served to make Japanese victories seem more impressive and spiritually significant. Defeating a competent but mortal enemy might have been a notable military achievement, but defeating supernatural forces of evil was proof of divine favor. The transformation of the Mongols from human opponents to demonic invaders made the Japanese victory seem cosmically significant rather than merely historically important. The role of the typhoons in ending both invasions became the subject of increasingly elaborate religious interpretation. The storms weren't just fortunate weather events, they were manifestations of specific Japanese deities who had taken personal interest in protecting the islands. Rajin, the thunder god, and Fujin, the wind god, were credited with creating the storms that destroyed the Mongol fleets. The sea goddess, Watatsumi, was said to have stirred up the waves that drowned the invaders. This religious interpretation of the Kamikaze became incorporated into Shinto theology and ritual practice. New ceremonies were developed to honor the gods who had protected Japan, and shrines were built specifically to commemorate the divine intervention that had saved the islands. The Kamikaze became not just a historical event, but a recurring religious celebration of Japan's special relationship with the divine. The mythologization process also extended to the physical artifacts of the invasions. Swords, supposedly used by legendary samurai heroes, became sacred relics with supernatural properties. Arrows, allegedly fired by famous archers, were preserved as objects of spiritual power. Even pieces of wood from destroyed Mongol ships were treated as sacred objects that embodied the divine protection of Japan. These relics served important cultural functions beyond their historical significance. They provided physical connections to the mythologized events, allowing future generations to touch objects that had supposedly been present during moments of divine intervention. They also served as focal points for religious devotion and sources of spiritual inspiration for warriors who hoped to emulate the legendary heroes of the invasions. The transformation of historical events into religious mythology had practical consequences for Japanese military development. The mythologized version of the invasions suggested that Japanese spiritual superiority and individual heroism were more important than tactical innovation or technological advancement. This interpretation discouraged military modernization and reinforced traditional approaches to warfare that had actually been inadequate against Mongol tactics. The legend of the Kamikaze also established a dangerous precedent for Japanese military thinking. The idea that divine intervention would protect Japan from foreign invasion became so deeply embedded in Japanese culture that it influenced strategic planning through the 19th century. The assumption that the gods would intervene to protect Japan from superior foreign forces became a substitute for practical military preparation. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the mythologization process was the way it shaped Japanese attitudes toward death in military service. The legendary samurai heroes of the invasions were remembered not just for their martial skill, but for their willingness to die beautifully in service to the divine emperor. This glorification of military suicide would eventually evolve into the Kamikaze attacks of World War II, when Japanese pilots deliberately crashed their planes into enemy ships in deliberate echoes of the divine wind that had protected Japan 7 centuries earlier. The mythological transformation of the Mongol invasions demonstrates the power of cultural narrative to reshape historical memory in ways that serve contemporary psychological needs. The Japanese needed to believe that their survival had been due to spiritual superiority rather than meteorological coincidence, and they gradually constructed a mythological framework that supported this interpretation. This mythologization wasn't necessarily dishonest or manipulative. The people who'd created and perpetuated these legends genuinely believed in the spiritual significance of the events they were commemorating. The transformation of history into mythology reflected sincere convictions about the nature of divine intervention and the special destiny of Japan. But the mythological version of the invasions became more influential than the historical reality, shaping Japanese military culture, religious practices, and national identity in ways that would have profound consequences for centuries. The Kamikaze became one of the foundational myths of Japanese civilization, proof that Japan was divinely protected and spiritually superior to all foreign nations. The failure of the Mongol invasions of Japan created ripple effects that extended far beyond the immediate military consequences. These weren't just local events that affected only Japan and the Mongol Empire. They were pivotal moments that altered the trajectory of world history in ways that are still visible today. The Kamikaze didn't just save Japan from conquest. It fundamentally changed the balance of power in East Asia and established patterns of Japanese behavior that would influence global events for centuries. The most immediate consequence was the effective end of Mongol expansion. After 2 catastrophic failures in Japan, Kublai Khan never again attempted such massive overseas invasions. The Mongol Empire, which had defined itself through constant conquest and expansion, suddenly found itself facing the reality that some objectives were simply beyond their reach. This psychological shift marked the beginning of the empire's transition from an aggressive, expanding force to a defensive confederation, struggling to maintain control over territories it had already conquered. The resources that the Mongol Empire had invested in the Japanese invasions were staggering even by imperial standards. The construction of invasion fleets, the training and equipping of massive armies, and the logistics of coordinating simultaneous attacks from multiple directions had required the dedication of enormous amounts of imperial wealth and manpower. When both invasions ended in total disaster, the empire found itself significantly weakened, just as other enemies were beginning to challenge Mongol authority in other regions. This weakening had cascading effects across the Mongol Empire. Chinese rebel movements, which had been dormant during the height of Mongol power, began to sense weakness and organize more effective resistance. The Yuan dynasty, which Kublai Khan had established in China, found itself facing increasing internal challenges that it could no longer suppress with the overwhelming force that had previously guaranteed Mongol dominance. In Central Asia, the failure of the Japanese invasions encouraged other Mongol Khanates to assert greater independence from central authority. The Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, and other Mongol successor states began to prioritize their own regional interests over imperial unity. The psychological authority of the Great Khan, which had been based largely on an aura of invincibility, was severely damaged by the visible failure of his most ambitious military projects. The human cost of the invasions also created long-term problems for the Mongol Empire. The loss of experienced military personnel, naval expertise, and engineering knowledge severely weakened Mongol capabilities, just as they were facing increasing challenges from enemies who had learned to counter traditional Mongol tactics. The empire that had once seemed capable of conquering the entire world suddenly found itself struggling to maintain control over territories it had already conquered. For Japan, the successful resistance to Mongol invasion created a completely different set of historical consequences. The conviction that Japan was divinely protected from foreign conquest became one of the foundational beliefs of Japanese culture, influencing everything from military doctrine to foreign policy to religious practice. This belief in special divine favor would make Japan uniquely resistant to foreign influence for the next 6 centuries. The psychological impact of the Kamikaze on Japanese military thinking cannot be overstated. The successful resistance to the most powerful military force in the world convinced the Japanese that spiritual purity and individual courage were more important than technological advancement or tactical innovation. This conviction would make Japan remarkably resistant to military modernization, even when faced with clear evidence that foreign powers had developed superior weapons and tactics. The mythologization of the invasions also established patterns of Japanese behavior that would persist for centuries. The emphasis on individual heroism over practical effectiveness, the glorification of death in military service, and the conviction that Japan was spiritually superior to foreign nations would all become permanent features of Japanese military culture. These attitudes would influence Japanese responses to foreign pressure through the Meiji Restoration and into World War II. The isolation that Japan experienced following the failed Mongol invasions was partly deliberate and partly accidental. The Japanese government, convinced that foreign contact led inevitably to foreign invasion attempts, began implementing policies designed to limit foreign influence and maintain Japanese purity. This eventually evolved into the Sakoku policy of complete isolation that would keep Japan closed to most foreign contact from the 17th to the 19th centuries. But the isolation was also partly imposed by external circumstances. The failure of the Mongol invasions convinced other potential invaders that Japan was too difficult and expensive a target to be worth conquering. The combination of geographic isolation, fierce indigenous resistance, and unpredictable weather patterns made Japan seem uniquely unconquerable, discouraging other foreign powers from attempting similar invasions. This reputation for unconquerability became a significant factor in East Asian geopolitics for centuries. Chinese dynasties that succeeded the Mongols generally avoided direct military confrontation with Japan, preferring to maintain diplomatic relations that acknowledged Japanese independence. Korean kingdoms, having witnessed the destruction of Mongol invasion fleets, had no interest in testing Japanese defensive capabilities themselves. The long-term isolation of Japan had profound consequences for global historical development. A Japan that had been conquered by the Mongols would have been integrated into the Chinese cultural sphere and would likely have developed along completely different lines. Instead, Japan remained an independent center of cultural and technological innovation, developing unique approaches to everything from military technology to artistic expression to social organization. The unique character of Japanese culture that developed during this period of isolation would eventually make Japan's entry into the modern world system particularly dramatic and disruptive. When Japan finally opened to foreign contact in the 19th century, it brought with it cultural attitudes and institutional structures that were unlike anything else in the world, creating both opportunities for rapid modernization and sources of conflict with other global powers. The memory of the Kamikaze also established a template for understanding how Japan could defeat superior foreign enemies through spiritual dedication and willingness to sacrifice. This template would be invoked repeatedly throughout Japanese history, from the resistance to Mongol invasion to the samurai rebellions of the 19th century to the Kamikaze attacks of World War II. The psychological legacy of the invasions was visible in Japanese responses to foreign pressure throughout their history. When Commodore Perry's black ships arrived in 1853 to force Japan to open to foreign trade, Japanese officials initially considered responses based on the precedent of divine protection against foreign invasion. When Japan fought modern wars against China and Russia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, Japanese military doctrine was still influenced by beliefs about spiritual superiority that traced back to the Kamikaze. The global consequences of Japanese isolation were equally significant. Europe's age of exploration and subsequent colonial expansion occurred largely without Japanese participation, allowing European powers to dominate global trade networks and establish colonial empires without significant Japanese competition. A Japan that had been integrated into the Mongol Empire might have participated in global exploration and colonization much earlier, fundamentally altering the pattern of world historical development. The technological development that occurred in isolated Japan also had global implications. Japanese metallurgy, particularly sword-making techniques, reached levels of sophistication that were unmatched anywhere else in the world. Japanese architectural innovations, artistic traditions, and social institutions developed along unique lines that would eventually influence global culture when Japan finally opened to foreign contact. Perhaps most significantly, the successful resistance to Mongol invasion established Japan as the only major East Asian civilization that had never been conquered by foreign powers. This unique historical experience gave Japan a different relationship to foreign influence and cultural change than any other major Asian civilization. While China, Korea, and Southeast Asian countries all had experience of foreign conquest and rule, Japan's historical memory was based entirely on successful resistance to foreign invasion. This unique historical experience would prove crucial in Japan's response to Western imperialism in the 19th century. While other Asian countries struggled to maintain their independence against European colonial expansion, Japan was able to draw on cultural memories of successful resistance to foreign invasion. The conviction that Japan was divinely protected and uniquely capable of defeating foreign enemies, which had originated with the Kamikaze, provided psychological resources for Japan's remarkable modernization and rise to global power status. The failure of the Mongol invasions also had important consequences for the development of naval technology and amphibious warfare tactics. The destruction of two massive invasion fleets by storms convinced military planners throughout East Asia that large-scale amphibious operations were inherently risky and possibly impossible. This belief discouraged the development of naval technologies and amphibious tactics for centuries, contributing to the relative stagnation of East Asian naval development compared to European maritime innovation. The economic consequences of the failed invasions were equally significant. The enormous cost of the invasion attempts, combined with their complete failure, demonstrated the limits of imperial resources and the dangers of overextension. This lesson influenced subsequent Chinese dynasties' approaches to military expenditure and foreign conquest, generally making them more cautious about expensive military adventures and more focused on defensive strategies. As we reach the end of this blood-soaked tale of divine intervention and military catastrophe, it's worth considering what the Mongol invasions of Japan actually meant in the broader context of human history. Were they really proof of divine protection, as the Japanese believed? Were they demonstrations of the limits of human military power, as the Mongols discovered? Or were they simply extraordinary coincidences that happened to occur at historically significant moments? The truth, as is often the case with events that become legendary, is probably more complex and more interesting than either the Japanese or Mongol interpretations suggested. The Kamikaze were real meteorological events, but typhoons in that region during late summer are relatively common. What made these particular storms historically significant wasn't their supernatural origin, but their incredible timing and devastating effectiveness against invasion fleets that were particularly vulnerable to severe weather. From a purely military perspective, the Mongol invasions of Japan were probably doomed regardless of weather intervention. The logistical challenges of maintaining large armies across ocean distances with 13th century technology were enormous. The Mongol forces that reached Japan were operating at the extreme limit of their supply lines, with no possibility of reinforcement or resupply if their initial invasion attempts failed. The Japanese defenders, for all their tactical disadvantages, were fighting on familiar terrain with short supply lines and popular support. Even if the typhoons hadn't intervened, the Mongol forces would have faced increasing difficulties maintaining their positions on hostile shores, while Japanese resistance organized more effective counterattacks. But this practical analysis misses the psychological and cultural significance of what actually happened. The Japanese didn't experience a fortunate coincidence followed by enemy withdrawal due to logistical problems. They experienced what appeared to be direct, divine intervention on behalf of their sacred islands, and this experience fundamentally shaped their understanding of their place in the world. The Mongols didn't experience a tactical setback due to overextended supply lines and difficult terrain. They experienced the complete destruction of the largest military force they had ever assembled, apparently due to supernatural intervention on behalf of their enemies. This experience forced them to confront the possibility that some objectives might be literally beyond their reach, regardless of the resources they committed to achieving them. The historical significance of the invasions lies not in what actually happened, but in what both cultures believed had happened, and how those beliefs influenced their subsequent behavior. The Japanese conviction that they were divinely protected from foreign conquest would influence their military thinking, foreign policy, and cultural development for centuries. The Mongol realization that even their empire had limits would contribute to the gradual end of their expansion and the beginning of their imperial decline. The invasions also demonstrated the importance of technological and tactical adaptation in military conflict. The Japanese forces that fought in 1274 were quickly overwhelmed by Mongol military innovations they had never encountered. The Japanese forces that fought in 1281 had learned from their earlier defeats and were much more effective against Mongol tactics. Military adaptation and learning were crucial factors in determining the outcomes of these conflicts, even though they were ultimately overshadowed by meteorological intervention. The cultural collision between Mongol and Japanese warrior traditions revealed fundamental differences in approaches to combat, honor, and the nature of military service. The Mongols represented a military system based on practical efficiency and collective coordination. The Japanese represented a military system based on individual excellence and spiritual dedication. The conflict between these approaches was never fully resolved, partly because external intervention prevented either system from proving its ultimate superiority. The invasions also highlighted the crucial role of geography in determining historical outcomes. Japan's island location provided natural protection that continental civilizations couldn't enjoy, but it also created vulnerabilities to naval attack that land-based enemies didn't face. The interaction between geographic factors and military technology created unique strategic situations that influenced the development of both Japanese and Mongol military doctrine. Perhaps most importantly, the invasions demonstrated the complex relationship between human agency and environmental factors in determining historical outcomes. The Japanese defenders fought with incredible courage and gradually improved their tactical effectiveness, but their ultimate victory was due to typhoons that they couldn't control or predict. The Mongol invaders employed superior military technology and tactics, but their defeat was caused by weather patterns that they couldn't anticipate or counter. This interaction between human effort and environmental chance would become a recurring theme in Japanese history. The conviction that divine protection would supplement human effort rather than replace it would influence Japanese approaches to everything from military preparation to economic development to cultural preservation. The mythologization of the invasions that occurred in subsequent centuries was both historically inevitable and culturally necessary. The Japanese needed to believe that their survival had been due to more than fortunate coincidence, and the myths they created to explain the Kamikaze provided psychological frameworks that supported Japanese cultural confidence and political independence. But the mythological interpretation of the invasions also created potential problems for Japanese strategic thinking. The assumption that divine protection would be available when needed could discourage practical military preparation and encourage dangerous overconfidence in confrontations with superior enemies. The template established by the Kamikaze would be invoked in later conflicts where environmental intervention was much less likely. The Mongol failure in Japan also had broader implications for the development of military technology and tactical doctrine throughout East Asia. The destruction of invasion fleets by storms discouraged the development of naval technologies and amphibious warfare capabilities, contributing to the relative stagnation of East Asian military innovation compared to European maritime development. The invasions ultimately represent one of history's most dramatic examples of the intersection between military, cultural, environmental, and psychological factors in determining the outcomes of major historical events. They demonstrate the limitations of even the most sophisticated military systems when confronted with environmental challenges they cannot control, and the power of cultural interpretation to transform historical events into foundational myths that influence behavior for centuries. The Japanese, who watched Mongol invasion fleets disappear into typhoon-driven chaos, were witnessing more than military defeat. They were seeing the birth of a national myth that would define their culture's relationship with the outside world for the next 7 centuries. The Mongols, who survived the destruction of their invasion fleets, were experiencing more than tactical setback. They were discovering the boundaries of imperial power and the limits of human military capability. In the end, the horrifying battles between the Mongols and the samurai weren't just military conflicts. They were moments when entire civilizations came face to face with forces beyond their control and were forced to reconstruct their understanding of what was possible in the world. The storms that destroyed the invasion fleets were natural phenomena, but their timing and effects were so extraordinary that they became indistinguishable from miracles. The Kamikaze saved Japan from conquest, but it also created a psychological legacy that would influence Japanese behavior in ways that were both inspiring and catastrophic. The divine wind became proof of Japanese spiritual superiority, but it also became a template for expecting supernatural intervention in conflicts where human preparation might have been more practical. The terrifying efficiency of Mongol military science had met the immovable object of Japanese cultural conviction, and both had been transformed by the encounter. The Mongols learned that even they had limits. The Japanese learned that their limits might be protected by forces beyond human understanding. Both lessons would echo through history, shaping the destinies of civilizations and the fates of millions of people who would never know the names of the warriors who fought and died on the beaches of Kyushu in 1274 and 1281. The storms that destroyed the Mongol fleets lasted only days, but their consequences lasted centuries. The battles between Mongols and samurai involved only thousands of warriors, but they influenced the lives of millions of their descendants. The Kamikaze was a local weather phenomenon, but it became a global historical force that shaped the development of East Asian civilization and the eventual emergence of modern Japan as a world power. This is the ultimate lesson of the Mongol invasions of Japan, that history is made not just by human decisions and cultural forces, but by the mysterious intersection of human effort and environmental chance, of individual courage and collective destiny, of earthly ambition and what the Japanese came to believe was divine intervention. The horrifying battles between the Mongols and the samurai were more than military conflicts. There were moments when the gods themselves seemed to take sides in human affairs, with consequences that would echo through the centuries until they reached our own time. And perhaps, in the end, that's exactly what they were. Thank you for watching this journey through one of history's most extraordinary military disasters and divine interventions. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the collision between Mongol efficiency and samurai honor, make sure to subscribe for more stories of historical catastrophes, military innovations, and the moments when human ambition met forces beyond human control. Hit that notification bell, because, unlike the Mongol Empire, I'll always let you know when the next invasion of historical content is coming your way.